In this step, let's create our first Spring Bean. What we want to do is inside the JVM, we would want to create a Spring context, and we would want to be able to have a bean with the name created. It would be a string value, and we'll have the Spring framework manage it for us. Let's get started. This is the class we have right now, App Gaming Basic Java. What we want to do is to create another class like this. Before we go any further, what I'll do is rename this. Right click, refactor, rename. And I'll call this App 01 Gaming Basic Java. This looks good. I'll press enter and I'll say continue. So the class is now renamed. It's App 01 Gaming Basic Java. And I'll also delete the application class which was created for us when we created the Spring project. We don't really need this for now. So I'll say right click, delete. So learn Spring Framework application.java. I'm going ahead and deleting it. So right now we just have one Java application that we can launch, and that's App 1 Gaming Basic Java. And if I run this, you know what the output would be, right? Right now it's running the Pac-Man game, and you see the actions from, and you can see the actions from the Pac-Man game in here. That looks cool. So what I'll do is now copy and paste this. Control C, Control V. And what I'll do now is rename this to App 02. So I'll call this Hello World Spring. So this is the Hello World Spring app to help us learn Spring. And what I'll do now is to open up App 02 Hello World Spring, and let's remove all the code which is present in here. We don't really need to worry about this code. I'll organize imports as well and save this. So we already have a JVM running, right? If I run this application, a JVM would be initialized, and inside that we would want to create a Spring context, and we would want to manage a specific thing name. We would want the Spring framework to manage that. How do we do that? So the steps which are involved are: one, launch a Spring application or Spring context as it is called. And the next thing is to configure the things that we want Spring framework to manage. So these are the things that we would want to do. So this is 1 and this is 2. One of the approaches that we can use to configure the things that Spring needs to manage is to use something called a configuration class. So we can create a configuration class and have everything defined. For example, name defined in here, and we can use the configuration class to launch a Spring context. Let's see how to do that right now. Let's start with creating a configuration class. So I'll go to the com in 28 minutes learn Spring framework package and say right click, new Java class, and I would create a Hello World configuration class. So let's create a Hello World configuration class and say finish. And this is a Spring configuration class. How do we indicate that? You can indicate that by adding an annotation at configuration. I've added in at configuration, and I would do an organize imports. You would see a import come in: org Spring framework context annotation configuration. As you can see the Java doc in here, it says indicates that a class declares one or more bean methods. So in here you can define Spring beans. The things which are managed by Spring are what are called Spring beans, and you can define the methods to create the Spring beans in your configuration class. So we now have the configuration class ready. That's awesome. So we have this one ready. We have a add configuration class. We would want to launch a Spring context with the add configuration class. How do we do that? The way we can do that is by using a class which is annotation config. So if you type in annotation config and press control space or command space, you should see annotation config application context come up. So what we are creating in here is a Spring context. So we would want to create inside the JVM a Spring context, and we are using a configuration class to create a annotation config application context. So we would want to create a new instance of this using the configuration file that we have created. The configuration file that we have created is hello world configuration. The configuration is empty. We'll fix that very, very soon. But for now, let's focus on launching a Spring context. So I'll say hello world configuration dot class, and I'll take this into a variable context. Variable context is equal to new annotation config application context, and we are going to launch hello world configuration. So the context is now ready. Let's see what would happen when I launch this up. So right click, run as Java application. The great thing is there are no errors. There are a lot of things happening in the background, but we see no errors in here. That's awesome. So we are now able to successfully launch a Spring context using a configuration file. So what we have right now is this state. We have a JVM and we have launched up a Spring context. And what we want to tell Spring is to manage a bean. I would want Spring to manage a name object. How can we do that? Let's go to our hello world configuration. And over here, I can create a method. Public string, name is a string object, so the return type is string. And I'll say name, and I'll say return and the value. Let's put Ranga in here. Is this sufficient to make it a Spring bean? Inside a configuration class, I created a method. The answer is no. You need to do an additional thing called @bean. If you do organize imports, you'd see org, Spring framework, context, annotation, bean come into picture. And you can see the Java doc which says indicates that a method produces a bean to be managed by the Spring container. You can see that there are a lot of ways we are referring to Spring. We are calling Spring context, Spring container. There are a lot of terminology which are used. We'll talk about it a little later. For now, the important thing to focus on is the fact that this specific method we have in here will produce a bean, and this bean will be managed by the Spring container. So let's go ahead and save this. And what I'll do is go back to our hello world Spring. Make sure that you're running the right thing. It's app02 hello world Spring. Let's go ahead and run this. Right click, run as Java application. And you'd see that there are no errors again. Now, how can we see our name object, which is managed by Spring? We have the Spring context ready in here. So what we'll do now is use the context to get the object. So what we are doing now is we have created the name object and it is being managed by Spring. So what we'll ask the Spring context is give me the name object. And the way you can do that is by saying context.get bean. Anything that is managed by Spring is called a bean. So we'll say context.get bean. And there are multiple ways you can retrieve values from a context. One of the ways is to use the name. The name that we have given in here is name. The method name is name. So this is exactly what will be returned in here as well. So context.getBean name. And what I'll do is do a sysout of this. So let's do a system.out.println of context.getBean name. So what we are doing in here is we have launched a Spring context. That's done and dusted. We have configured the things we want to manage. Where did we do that? We did that by creating a hello world configuration class. And in the hello world configuration class, we have the annotation at configuration. And inside this, we also created a name method with the @bean annotation. What we are doing now is retrieving beans managed by Spring. And the way we can retrieve the beans is by using context.getBean and giving the name of the bean. There are a lot of other methods we'll be exploring a little later, for example, by type and things like that. For now, let's keep it simple and do a context.getBean name. And let's launch this up. Right click, run as Java application. What do you see? Ranga. Isn't that awesome? So what we are doing right now is Spring is managing this specific bean for us. So we have our JVM and Spring is managing a specific object name for us. There are a lot of other wonderful things that you need to understand about Spring Framework. In this step, we got started with the Spring Framework. There might be a number of questions at the back of your mind. I'm sure of that. So let's explore all those questions in the next few steps.